Welcome to Chapter 5 and the top 12 highlights of Chapter 5 with Mr. Rodman. We're going to start by taking a look at political efficacy. If you remember from the last chapter, we did talk about the idea of a citizen being able to understand and influence political events, how they understand how the process works as part of our political efficacy. The more we understand, the more we can take part in that. That leads us to internal efficacy, this idea of not just understanding, but also taking part in political affairs. External efficacy is then how the government, the system, responds to the citizens in terms of resources, in terms of crisis or natural disaster. That's the external efficacy component. So we see it here in terms of the ability to produce an effect. The belief that we can take part in those politics is internal, and that government responds to the needs of the everyday citizen is the external efficacy we see going on here. Demographics is the study of population characteristics, and that's looking at all of the different pieces that shape and environmental factors that shape up to make the snowflake that we talk about. The idea of where you're born and what family you're growing up in and what gender you are and what race, what religion, what part of the country you're living in. All of those things help shape and define who we are, our ideology. And that ideological makeup is composed of all of these different population characteristics known as demographics. Now remember, we're socialized by our family first and foremost. There are lots of other factors that weigh into that, such as the media and religion and school and friends. But the number one factor here is the family in terms of that socialization. We then get to cleavages, and the first one is really the reinforcing cleavage, and that's what you see here with the red boxes. This basically says, looking at a particular the particular demographics of a person, we can reinforce the definition of the ideology they are. In this case, on the left, we see a conservative that is comprised of a male, Asian American, who is a parent and possibly poor or wealthy. They've had less than a high school education, but they've pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, and they do attend church regularly. They live in the Midwest, and chances are they live in the burbs. They live in the suburbs somewhere. So that would be reinforcing cleavages that really reinforce each demographic group, reinforces or strengthens the cleavages that we see there that really confirm that they are in fact a conservative. So a white Protestant male, like you see here in the example, would be a reinforcing cleavage. The chances are they are going to be conservative and they're going to vote Republican. Now what we see in the liberal camp, same thing, again reinforcing, is that these characteristics are further defining and supporting the idea that they are liberal and will vote Democratic. So in this case we have a woman who is African American. She's young, she is middle income, she has had some college or maybe gotten her degree. She's Catholic. She lives in the Northeast, and chances are she lives in an urban center. And so those things again reinforce the cleavages of her demographics that define her as a liberal ideological perspective. And that's the reinforcing cleavage at work in both of these examples. Now what we see in the next type of cleavage is what we call cross-cutting, the idea of the environmental factors that don't quite reinforce those cleavages. So in this case, we're not able to quickly define whether or not they're going to vote Democratic or Republican, or that we can even define this type of a candidate, or excuse me, this type of a voter. In this case, we have a woman who is classified as a liberal in one sense, but she's Asian American, which tends to vote more conservatively. She is middle-aged but single, which tends to be more liberal. She did have high school education. She attends church regularly. She lives in the South, and chances are in an urban center there. So these are what we call cross-cutting cleavages. They don't really reinforce each other. They don't really define the ideology that she has. So she could be conservative voting Republican in one election. She could be more liberal voting Democratic in the other. And this is really where Downs' theory of rational choice comes in, because we know that as time goes on, we see voters that are more in the middle. They swing to the left to vote Democratic, they swing to the right to vote Republican, but they tend to be in the middle, not really too far to the left or too far to the right, and cross-cutting cleavages further define this type of person. It's really hard for a campaign to define how this person is going to vote when we get them to the polls. We obviously are trying to get everybody out to the polls, but the cross-cutting cleavages make it much harder to determine how they're going to vote. Are they going to vote for your candidate, or are they going to be voting along the other party lines? And that's the difficulty that we see with cross-cutting cleavages. We go back to de Tocqueville in this chapter, talking about democracy in America. Why was it so successful? Why was it such a great example of how democracy should work? There are a lot of factors. I'm reminded of the quote where he says that, yet what takes place in the U.S. is much less attributable to the institutions of the country than to the country itself. The geographic makeup, the abundant fertile soil, the lack of people that can invade it, and countries that can be surrounded by it. We are barriered by oceans, which help in this regard to prevent other countries from nosing into our business or taking over. A lack of a feudal aristocracy, lots of opportunities for capitalism, for being able to make a living and work hard, and that independent spirit is at work there. All of these contributed to this idea that de Tocqueville was looking for here in terms of how it would help define and shape the type of democracy we have in America today. Now let's look fast forward to 2010, and we see that this continues in terms of the movements that we see from the Rust Belt and the Midwest down to the South and to the Sun Belt and to the upper West coast in terms of where people are moving. Now each one of these is indicating a move of about 780,000 people at the very least in order to make that change. So we're looking at, upwards of 3 million people over the past 10 years that have moved to Texas. That's a significant number in terms of changes that are taking place there. And this, again, goes back to de Tocqueville's ideas of what democracy was all about, and this idea of American exceptionalism, where we would first hear it for the first time. I'm also reminded by one of the things that de Tocqueville said, which Hillary Clinton tends to attribute, which is this idea of America is great because America is good. And this is attributed back to de Tocqueville in his experiences in traveling the country and seeing all of the great things that made up the country that it is, and especially the geography and the people that really shaped and influenced his opinion here. Looking at the regional differences, not just the migration that we saw after the war that led to some of the changes that we see here in 2010 and continue to change, which we'll see again in 2020, but look at the makeup of this landscape. This election was won by President Obama in 2008, but as you can see from the blue, there's a lot of red out there too. Our country is very bifurcated in terms of the red-blue dichotomy, and we see even in places like Alaska and places like Arizona, you tend to see a lot of blue, and even in places like California, you tend to see a lot of red. And look at Oregon, pretty significant there in terms of the red. Even in Maryland, you see lots of red counties that the blue ones tend to put them over the top, but there is a lot of red out there. So we are very much a country that is a changing demographic, and as we become a more majority-minority nation, we tend to see those demographics changing once again. What are we seeing today? Well, we're seeing that one out of 8 Americans is actually living in California. More people going from rural to urban settings. 3 out of 4 people living in cities and close suburbs or city centers. And the impact here is that it does affect the demographics. We know that urban people tend to vote more liberal. Rural people tend to vote more conservative. And so this definitely has an impact. We know that the suburbs are the places where the battles for the campaigns and the elections are won or lost, depending on get out the vote. So these are significant in terms of the changes that are being made there. Taking a closer look at some of the regional differences that we see here, we know that the South, the Midwest, the Plain states tend to be more conservative, where the Northeast, the West and upper Midwest tend to be more liberal. And we see that evidenced in some of the data we looked at here in those reinforcing and cross-cutting cleavages. We know urban dwellers tend to be more liberal, where again, where the suburbs are where the contest and the fight for the next election is won or lost. In terms of regional differences by race, we see African Americans having a very strong voting pattern in terms of a demographic group. Now, they do have a lower turnout than white voters, but in terms of other minorities, they do tend to vote, and about 90% of the time they're voting Democratic. 95% of them voted for Obama in 2008 and 2012. We also do see that education and income levels are correlated here in terms of the differences between white and African American voters. This does tend to disappear when we're looking at socioeconomic status, but this does tell us why voters probably are more aligned with the liberal ideology. And looking at this again in terms of those differences in party identification, we see where white voters more aligned with Republicans, where black non-Hispanic voters more aligned with Democrats by far, without question, and Hispanics are as well. And that leads us to number 8, the regional differences with Hispanics. We see here that they're not very monolithic. There are lots of different backgrounds that they're coming from. That's Mexico, Cuba, Latin America. They do tend to vote Democratic, except for Cuban Americans, which tend to vote more conservatively, many times because of the anti-communist and Castro movement. Obama got 2/3 of the Hispanic vote in 2008, and we do call them the sleeping giant, because if they do turn out to vote, they really can have a huge impact on the election, but we do tend to see them voting more liberally. Looking at Asian Americans, also not very monolithic in terms of their voting patterns. Japanese Americans tend to vote more with Democrats, more with the liberal contingent, but we tend to see the other groups of Asian Americans, such as Koreans and Chinese and others, tend to vote more conservatively than Japanese Americans do. Income and education definitely has a role here, and we see that correlated with the higher levels of political participation in terms of the ideologies that come out to vote. In terms of religious diversity, we tend to see voting with the liberals are more Democratic, tend to be Catholics and Jewish persons. We also tend to see Protestants voting more Republican, especially the fundamentalist Protestants. And this goes back to a very long time in which Protestants are voting in that regard. The Catholic candidates voting more Democratic and have been. We saw that in 1960, again in 1928, and other candidates along the way. Al Gore choosing Joe Lieberman as a Jewish vice presidential candidate in trying to win over the Democratic vote there from the Jewish contingent. And we've also seen vice presidents like Joe Biden that are Catholic, again appealing to the Catholic demographic group to keep them voting Democratic. We see Mormon and conservatives, Mitt Romney in the 2012 campaign being a conservative and also a Mormon, trying to win over that vote. And we do see that religious identification definitely has a huge role in getting people out to vote. We know voter apathy is rampant, but not among those that regard religion as very highly identified. So we see Jewish people voting 90% of the time, no affiliation people voting 60% of the time. So you can see the impact that religious identification and diversity really has on voter participation. And in terms of this, we see this in terms of the breakdown of where people fall in the general population. We see 51% are Protestant. Of the Protestant faith, Roman Catholic 24%, Jewish little under 2%, and other religions or no religion actually taking up a pretty significant portion there, under 16%, Muslim under 0.6%, and Buddhist very similar to that. So a very large contingent of Protestant, and we know that they vote. Same things with Catholic and the Jewish contingent. We know that those groups vote, and the more they're correlated to their religions, the more they will turn out to participate in elections. Let's look at gender for a second. The gender gap being a huge issue and potentially a big one in this election. We haven't seen a huge difference until the last 30 years in terms of how men and women were voting. But that has definitely taken a turn, as we talked about in class in the 2008 and 2012 elections. You see here in the 2008 data that women tended to vote for the liberal candidate or the Democratic candidate, President Obama, in that election, much more so than men, and men conversely voting for McCain more so than women in that election. So this is this is a trend we have seen: women voting for Democrats or the liberals, and the um, the males voting for the conservative or the Republican candidate, and that has definitely taken place over the last 30 years. In terms of demographics, looking once again at how this structure, and Dr. Magleby goes in more detail here, in terms of the changing family structure, a question I got in class, which was a great one, was, are these still changing over time? The answer is absolutely. We see the family structures changing. We went from a traditional family unit with a mother and a father and 2.2 kids and a picket fence and a dog and a cat, to single parent homes, to one parent raising a number of kids, and that family structure continues to change. We see multi-generational families that are living together under one roof, and that is definitely different than what we saw in the last 50 years. We see higher education levels tending to prompt higher levels of political participation, and wealth and income also correlating there with that higher level of participation. We are not very class conscious, not nearly as much as you would see in other nations, say in Europe or in India or other places where social class still has some type of a role, but we don't see that so much here. But we do see that age does have a factor. We tend to see the senior citizens, the older voters, voting more with their camps, and we do see older voters voting more conservatively, voting for keeping their programs of Medicare, Social Security, and then slimming back on other areas of government in order to be able to pay for that. So they continue to have more and more influence in politics as long as they vote and young people don't, and that's the downside, unfortunately, for the young people, because as long as they continue to not be an active voting population, it's harder for them to have significant influence with elected officials. So, in terms of elements of the American political system, de Tocqueville set us straight in terms of these types of things we look for. Liberty, we value it. We value our freedoms. We value equality, again, not in economic, but everywhere else. We value democracy in terms of electing our leaders. We also value civic duty in terms of the rights that we hold and the responsibilities that we have there in terms of getting out to vote and doing our part to be a part of being an informed voter in that civic society. And then having individual responsibility to care as part of a neighborhood, as part of a community of American society, and doing your part to be a part of that society. So what unifies the United States? We close with this, and this is looking at this idea of a shared commitment to democratic values, part of our community that values electing our leaders and making those decisions based on informed opinions that form those decisions that we make. Economic opportunity: if you work hard, you keep what you earn, and that's so important as we see today. The work ethic, the importance of and the value of hard work, and the American dream: being able to own your own home and being able to own your own business and to be able to set your own hours and work at your pace and to keep the money that you earn. All of these are part of the ideals and the values that shape Americans in the United States today. Education is so important and a unifying factor, as is those economic and social mobility factors that we talk about. People being able to move up the ladder and being able to have a better life for them and for their kids. World War II definitely gave us that sense of national identity, and while it isn't as strong as what we saw during and after World War II, it definitely is there. together. And events like 9/11 or events like a natural disaster like Hurricane Sandy or the wildfires definitely bring us together in those types of things and show us the values that we hold dear and that we find most important. Those are really the things that pull us all together. I hope you've found this helpful on Chapter 5. I wish you well. Don't forget to go back through your concept cards and your reading guide, and good luck on the quiz.